Chapter 24 of The Adventures of Joel Pepper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kay Hand. The Adventures of Joel Pepper by Margaret SIDNEY. Chapter 24. How Joel Started the Fire. "Now," said Polly to the old stove, "just remember how you acted that day when Mamsie made Mrs. Brown's jelly." She was standing in front of it, and she drew herself up very straight. "You ought to be ashamed, you naughty thing, you, to make such trouble. Now I've stuffed you up all good and nice in the holes, and when I come home I'll build a fresh fire, and then, says I, you've got to bake a whole batch of bread just as nice." And Polly shook her brown head very decidedly and whirled off to the bedroom door. "Come, Phronsie," she called. "Hurry up, pet." "Oh, dear me." Phronsie still sat on the floor by the big bureau, with one red-tipped shoe in her hand, patting it. "The other one is on, Polly," said Phronsie as she saw Polly's face. "Truly it is." And she stuck one foot out. "I should think it was," laughed Polly. "Every button is in the wrong buttonhole, Phronsie." Phronsie looked at the little shoe very gravely. Then her lip quivered. "Dearie me, that's no matter," exclaimed Polly. "We'll have that all right in a twinkling." So she sat down on the floor and took Phronsie's foot in her lap and unbuttoned and buttoned up the shoe. "There now, that's done as spick-span as can be." "What is spick-span, Polly?" said Phronsie. "Oh, nice, just right. Dear me, it means ever so many things," said Polly with a little laugh. "Now then, let's have the other shoe on." And she held out her hand for it. "Let me put it on," cried Phronsie, drawing it back in alarm. "Let me, Polly. Oh, I want to put it on my very own self, I do." "Well, so you shall," promised Polly, "if you'll hurry, for you know I've got to bake my bread when I get back." "Isn't there any bread?" asked Phronsie, drawing on the little shoe and pausing, lost in thought, when it was half on. "Yes, just enough to last till I get the new loaves baked," said Polly, longing to give the shoe a twitch and expedite matters. "That is, I think so. I never know how much Joel will eat." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Phronsie, much troubled. "See here now, pet," cried Polly decidedly, "if you don't put on that shoe quickly, I shall have to do it, for we must start," which had the effect to make the little red-topped shoe slip on to Phronsie's fat foot in a trice. "Now then, we're ready," said Polly at last, tying on Phronsie's pink sunbonnet. "Come, Phronsie," and she took her hand. "Joel," she called as they went out the doorway, "where are you?" "Here," said Joel, thrusting his head down the loft stairs, where he had heard every word that Polly had said to the old stove. "Now you and Davy must look after the little brown house," said Polly, feeling very grown up and important, "and be good boys while we're gone down to the store after the bundle of sacks Mr. Atkins has got for Mamsie." "Yes," said Joel, "we will, Polly." So Polly ran over the stairs and kissed Joel and little Davy, who crowded up for one also, and then Phronsie had come up to be kissed too. "What are you two boys doing?" asked Polly. "Nothin'," said Joel. David was silently digging his toes back and forth on the floor. "Well, you better come right down and play in the kitchen," said Polly. "Then you can look after things." And she helped Phronsie downstairs and took her hand, and they walked down the path and off on to the road in a very dignified way. For Polly loved to be fine, and it was always a gala occasion when she could dress Phronsie up neat and nice for a walk to the store. "I very much wish we had a parasol," sighed Polly, who could never get over the longing for one, ever since she saw Miss Pettengill's green sunshade, with waving fringe, that she carried to church. "But then, I don't suppose I'll ever get one," and she sighed again. "It's nice to be walking down to the store, Polly," observed Phronsie, peering up at her from the depths of the pink sunbonnet, and smoothing her pink calico gown down in front. "So it is, chick," said Polly, with a merry laugh. "I don't believe anybody ever had such perfectly good times as we do in all this world." "No, "I don't believe they ever did," said Phronsie, shaking her yellow head, delighted to see Polly gay once more. So they walked on quite contentedly. Meanwhile, Joel turned to Davy up in the loft. "We'll keep the crickets in the box," he said, "till by and by, and go down, 'cause Polly said so. And I'm going to help her, you'll see." With these mysterious words he shoved a tin box half full of hopping black crickets under the bed, saying, "There, the cover's on. Come on, Dave," and scrambled down the stairs to the kitchen. Little David went down more slowly, as if something were on his mind. When he reached the kitchen, Joel was standing in front of the stove, a pile of paper was down on the floor at his feet, and he had a match in his hand. Davy stared at him in amazement. "I'm going to help Polly," declared Joel, loudly, holding his match quite fast with one hand, while he twitched off one of the covers with the lifter. "Oh, Joe, you aren't going to make a fire?" cried little David, horror-stricken and rooted to the spot. "Of course I am," declared Joel, boldly. "I heard Polly talking to the old stove just before she went away, and she's got to bake bread when she gets home, and it's all right, and she'll be so glad to see it ready for her." All the time he was talking, he was stuffing the paper into the stove. Then he ran into the woodshed, bringing out some kindlings. "We've got to fill the wood box, Dave," he said, to make talk and divert David's mind, and he crammed the wood in after the paper, till there wasn't much room left. "You ought not to do it, Joe. Oh, dear me, do stop," implored David, clasping his hands. "I'm big enough," declared Joel, strutting around and pulling at the things that Polly said were dampers, though why they should be damp when there was a fire in the stove every day he could never see. "And when Polly sees that I can make as good as she can, she'll let me do it every day. Yes, sirree." With that he drew the match and held it to an end of the paper sticking up. And forgetting to put back the cover, he raced off to the woodshed again for another armful of kindling. "Joel!" screamed David, left behind in the kitchen. "Come! Oh, we're afire! We're afire!" Joel dropped his kindlings and the heavier pieces of wood he had gathered up, and went like a shock back to the stove again. Great tongues of flame were shooting up toward the dingy ceiling. "Why didn't you put the cover on?" cried he, terribly frightened, for he began to think, after all, perhaps it would be quite as well to let Polly make the fire. "It'll be all right, I'll have it on in a minute," suiting the action to the word, as he lifted the lifter into the cover and advanced to the stove. "Oh, Joe, you'll be burnt up," cried David in a dreadful voice and wringing his hands. Joel made a dash, but the flame swirled out at him, so he backed off. "You can't do it," screamed Davy. "Don't try it, Joe. You'll be all burnt up." When Davy said that he couldn't do it, Joel made up his mind that he would. Besides, the very thought of the little brown house taking fire turned him desperate with fright, so he made a second dash, and somehow, he never could tell what made it, the cover slid on, and the flames muttered away to themselves inside, in a smothered kind of way, and there they were, shut up as tight as could be. "'Twas just as easy as nothing," said Joel, drawing a long breath, and beginning to strut up and down, still carrying the cover lifter. "You're such a 'fraid cat, Dave," he added scornfully. David was beyond caring whether or no he was called a 'fraid cat, being stiff with fright, so Joel strutted away to his heart's content. "Now I must put in more wood," he declared, and twitching off the cover, he crammed the stove as full as it would hold, on top of the blazing mass. Then he wiggled the dampers again, to suit him, paying particular attention to the little one in the pipe, then wiped his grimy hands, in great satisfaction, on his trousers. "You see, 'tisn't anything to make a fire," he observed to David, "and I'm going to build it every single day after this. Polly'll be so s'prised. Now, come on, Dave, let's go and play." And Joel gave a long and restful stretch. Little David, seeing the stove behaving so well, gave a sigh of relief, and coming slowly out of his fright, clattered after Joel, and soon they were down back of the house, where they had scooped out the ground, and filling it with water, had made what they called a pond. Here they now began to sail boats made out of bits of paper. "Hi there, you!" shouted a harsh voice. Joel and David, absorbed in getting their boats across the pond without running into each other, didn't hear. "Hi!" yelled the voice again. "Your house is afire." Joel lifted his black head and stared. "Come here, you!" screamed a man, jumping out of a wagon in the middle of the road in front of the little brown house. He was big and red-headed, and he held a whip in his hand. This he shook frantically up toward the roof, screaming, "Your house is afire!" Sure enough, great volumes of smoke came pouring out of the chimney, which wasn't any too good, and once in a while a tongue of flame would sweep out, licking the sides of the bricks, as much to say, "You can't shut me up entirely, you see." Oh, how merrily they danced! "Get a bucket! Step lively if you want to save your house!" roared the man at Joel, who took one good look at the chimney, then sprang for Mamsie's pail. "Get something, Dave!" he screamed, "and bring some water!" Now that the fire really had come, David, strange to say, felt all his fright dropping from him. It was as if Mamsie said, "Save the little brown house, dears," and he rushed on the wings of the wind over down across the lane, and helped himself to Grandma Bascom's big bucket, always standing on a bench beside her kitchen door. And with it almost full of water, he soon stood by the big red-headed man's side. "You're a likely-headed pair of chaps," said the man, as Joel dashed up with his pail, which he hadn't been able to find at once, as Mamsie had put some cloth she was going to bleach into it, and set it in the woodshed. "Now then, I must climb the roof, and you two boys must keep handing up the water as smart as you can." "Oh, I'm going up on the roof," cried Joel, and springing up the gutter pipe. "D'ye think you kin?" asked the man. But Joel was already halfway up, and presently the first pail of water was handed up, and splash it went on the flames, by this time coming out very lively at the chimney top. But it didn't seem to do any good, only to sizzle and siss, for just as soon as a pail full of water was dashed on, out they popped again, as bright as ever. A boy, coming whistling down the road, stopped suddenly, took one look, and ran like lightning over across the fields on a short cut. "Fire! Fire!" he screamed, and pretty soon, by dint of jumping stone walls and fences, he got into the street, at the end of which stood Mr. Atkins's grocery store. "Fire! Fire!" he bawled every step of the way. "Where? Where?" cried the people at the store, rushing to the door and craning their necks as he flew by, intent on getting to the fire engine house, so as to run back with the men who dragged the machine by the ropes. "At the Pepperses' little brown house," bawled the boy, plunging on. "Now, Polly," Mr. Atkins was just saying when the boy's scream was heard, "you tell your ma she needn't hurry about these coats. I guess that paper'll cover 'em, and if I put another knot in the string, my land, what's that?" "Fire! Fire!" the boy was bawling all along the street. "It's the Pepperses' little brown house." Somebody said, "Poor children." Others, "Don't let 'em hear." "Too late," and various other things. "Come, Phronsie," said Polly hoarsely, seizing the little fat hand. Phronsie, who was regarding some very pink and white sticks in a big candy jar on the shelf, tore her gaze away, and followed obediently as Polly pulled her along to the door. "Oh, Polly, you hurt me," she said in a grieved way. "Here, I'll take you," cried an old farmer with a long beard that looked like a bunch of hay, and he seized Phronsie and set her in his big wagon. Polly hopped in beside. "Don't be scart, we'll all go down and help," screamed a half-dozen voices after her. Rattle, rattle, clang came the fire engine, the boy who had brought the news having secured one of the most important places at one of the long ropes. And away they went, the procession gaining in length and strength at each step, till it seemed as if all of Badgertown were on the road and bound for the little brown house. The big red-headed man had dashed up to the roof by the side of Joel. "You better go down and hand water," he said, "and bring the axe. We may have to cut away the roof." Joel, knowing it was worse than useless to disobey, slid down, and got the axe first, to have it ready, oh, dreadful thought, to cut the little brown house with, and then the two buckets, as full as they could be lifted, went up, and came down empty. Up and down, up and down. "Here come the folks," yelled the man on the roof. "Now we are all right. Don't you be scart, boys, the fire engine's comin'." None too soon. A little fork of flame was just beginning to pop its head out between the shingles close to the chimney, as if to say, "You really needn't think you are going to keep us shut up." Up clattered the fire engine with a dreadful noise into the backyard, which suddenly seemed to be full of people of all sizes. Joel, when he saw the firemen on hand, sprang for the roof again. This time he staggered up with his bucket of water. "Oh, Joel!" He looked down and saw, as well as he could, for something seemed to be the matter with his eyes, Polly's face. Now that the danger was all over, for of course the fire engine and all those people would save the little brown house, Polly was the last person whom Joel really wanted to see. And he busied himself in helping to haul up the water buckets, that now came up pretty lively as the boys filled them and handed them to the firemen. "You'd better get down," said more than one fireman. The roof now seemed to swarm with them. "I ain't going to," said Joel, obstinately, reaching for another bucket. "It's our house, so there." "Let him alone," said the big red-headed man. "He'll work as smart as any two of you men. If it hadn't 'a' been for him and that one there," pointing with a grimy thumb to David on the ground, still patiently getting water and handing up his bucket, "we'd 'a' been all burnt up by this time." Joel's face got fiery red all through the smut and grime. "If it hadn't been for me," and down went his black head. Would Mamsie and Polly ever forgive him? "Oh, Joel!" screamed Polly from the ground, looking up at him piteously. "Do come down, dear." But he really didn't hear now. It seemed to him if he didn't work to the very last he could never look Mamsie in the face again, so he was now on the other side of the chimney where the fire was the hottest. "It's an even chance if we save it," Joel heard one of the firemen say. "It's got in between the joints, see?" "Then we've got to cut just that spot," said the big red-headed man, who by reason of being on hand first was considered to be the leader, and he swung his axe over his head. Crash! Went the little brown roof. At the sound, Polly dragged Phronsie over to David's side. "Now then, in with the water lively, boys, and splash her out," cried the big red-headed man, who very much liked being a leader. And thereupon he stopped working and set the others at it in such a brisk fashion that the water ran down in perfect rivers all over the roof, one or two of the streams soaking through, to drop into Ben's and Joel's and David's bedroom in the loft. "It's out! It's out!" bawled some of the firemen on the roof to the men and boys. "You don't need to send up any more water." "Look behind you!" screamed the boy who had first discovered the fire. He seemed to have eyes in the back of his head, and the firemen, whirling around, saw a little tongue of flame shooting determinedly up. It had run along underneath the shingles and hopped at the first chance it could get. So the buckets of water had to keep on flying up, to come down and be filled. Up and down, till Polly sank on the grass, unable to bear it another bit longer. "Oh, if I weren't a girl," she moaned passionately, "then I could be up there, and I know I'd save the little brown house. Oh, Mamsie, Mamsie!" "Don't fret, Polly," said a good woman living in the village, for by this time a long procession of men, women, and children had hurried in, crowding and jamming into the yard. "If it burns down, you shall all come to our house and stay a spell till you get another one." "Don't!" cried Polly passionately and shrinking off. "We can't live if the little brown house goes. Oh, Mamsie, Mamsie!" And she sobbed as if her heart would break, and covered her face with her hands. "Don't cry, Polly," and Phronsie's little hand crept softly up to her neck. But Polly couldn't stop. If there had been anything for her to do, she would have kept up, but to sit there and see the little brown house burn up, and know because she was a girl there was no place for her on the roof, why there she was, sobbing as if her heart would break, and Phronsie clinging piteously to her neck. A ringing shout struck upon her ear. "It's coming!" shivered Polly. "The roof's tumbling in!" And she hid her face lower yet. Wouldn't God stop the dreadful fire ever yet? He must, for Mamsie said he loved to help all his children, and "Hooray, Polly!" called Joel in her ear, putting a very black face up close to her pale one. "Don't you understand? It's all out. It is, truly, this time, every single squinchin' bit." But Polly didn't understand. and they laid her back on the grass, and one woman said, "Get a palm leaf fan," and another cried, "Get the water in that pail there," pointing to one not used, on the grass. And everybody got in everybody else's way, and crowded around her, and the water was dashed over her face till she was in a little pool of it, and still she didn't open her eyes. And Phronsie wailed and clung to her, getting as wet, so a thin woman remarked, as a drowned rat, and David was on the other side nearly as bad. As for Joel, he rushed up and down, completely gone with fright. After all his brave fight, to have Polly give out was something so very dreadful he couldn't think of it. "Here comes Mrs. Pepper," said somebody, and "Thank the Lord," said another. And down the road in the doctor's gig, the little doctor driving like mad, came Mamsie. They helped her out, and she was in the yard, never looking at the little brown house, for her black eyes were searching among the crowd, and her white lips tried to frame some words. "All safe, marm," sang out the big red-headed man, "and you've got some smart chaps," thinking he'd give all the comfort, and at once, that was in his power. "Polly ain't just well," spoke up somebody sympathetically, and in a minute Mamsie was down on the grass, with Polly's head in her lap, the other children swarming around her, and Dr. Fisher in the midst. "Oh, I'm so ashamed," gasped Polly, coming to, and hiding her face on Mrs. Pepper's breast. "Don't you feel badly, Polly, child," said Mamsie, smoothing her brown hair gently. "You're all tired out. The little brown house is all safe. Just think of that." Polly thrust up her head and took one look. "Mamsie," she whispered, holding to Mrs. Pepper's neck convulsively, "God did stop the dreadful fire, didn't He?" "He sure did," said Mrs. Pepper, looking around on all her little group. The neighbors and townspeople, the firemen and the crowd, stole silently off and left them there, but Dr. Fisher stayed. Suddenly Joel was missing. "Where is he?" asked Mrs. Pepper, a fresh alarm gathering on her face. "P'raps he's gone with the engine," piped up the boy who had discovered the fire, and who seemed to think it was his duty to watch that it didn't break out again. "Oh, no, Joel wouldn't do that," said Mrs. Pepper. "I'll find him," said little Dr. Fisher, who had his own views about Joel, after closely regarding his singed eyebrows and black face. "Lucky enough if he doesn't need considerable patching up," he muttered to himself, as he stole off to reconnoitre. "There's no use in your hiding," he said aloud, as if talking to someone, "so you might as well come out at once, and let me know where you're hurt, Joe, and I'll fix you before your mother sees you." "I ain't hurt," said a voice from the lilac bushes. "Oh, you are not?" said the little doctor, opening the bushes to peer within, his spectacles setting well down on the end of his nose, so that he looked over them. "That's good," and he soon had Joel out. "Now then, I'll fix you up as good as ever," and he rummaged his ample pockets for the things he had thrust into them for this very work. "I ain't hurt," said Joel, wriggling furiously. "Stand still, Joe," said the little doctor coolly, "for I'm going to patch you up so that you're decent to see your mother. Aren't you ashamed to get this way when Polly, poor brave girl, has been sick? Why, what's the matter with you?" Suddenly giving Joel a whirl so that he could take a look in his face. Joel's face was working frightfully. "I most burnt the little brown house up," he gasped. "I made a fire in the stove." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Adventures of Joel Pepper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kay Hand. The Adventures of Joel Pepper by Margaret SIDNEY. Chapter 25. Joel sells shoes for Mr. Beebe. The little doctor kept a firm hold on Joel's jacket and gazed keenly into his face. He said. "I wanted to help Polly," gasped Joel. "Oh, dear me." He was a sight to behold, as the tears washed their way down the grimy face, which was still working fearfully as he tried to hold in his sobs. "So you thought you'd help Polly," said Dr. Fisher kindly. Was that it, Joel?" "Yes," said Joel. "She'd put the putty in, and put it in, and—" "Put the putty in?" repeated the little doctor, aghast. "Yes, or Ben had." "I never in all my life heard of burning putty in a stove," said Dr. Fisher, helplessly, and setting his big spectacles again, as if that might possibly assist him to understand. "Oh, she didn't burn it!" cried Joel, just as much astonished. "Well, what did she do with it, then?" demanded Dr. Fisher. "Dear me, I always supposed a stove was meant to burn things in," and he waved his head helplessly and regarded Joel with a fixed stare. "She stuck the putty in the holes," said Joel very distinctly. "Don't you understand? Polly's stove is very old, and it's cracked, and she says the air comes in and then the fire goes down, so she has to stuff up all the mean old cracks. Oh, dear me, I wanted to help her," and off Joel went in another gust of tears. "I suppose Polly feels badly over her stove sometimes," reflected Dr. Fisher, casting a very sharp glance on Joel. "I really wonder if she does," he added carelessly. "Feels badly!" exploded Joel. Then he took a long look around on all sides, and leaned over to whisper in the little doctor's ear. "She cries sometimes, Polly does." "No!" exclaimed Dr. Fisher. "Yes, she does," declared Joel, shaking his stubby head decidedly. "She cries dreadfully when Mamsie isn't looking. And she didn't know that I saw her either. I only peeked behind the pantry door. And I wanted to help her." He began to cry afresh at the recollection. "Joel," said Dr. Fisher, getting up suddenly, "you've got to tell your mother how the little brown house got on fire." "I know," said Joel, but his head drooped, and his eyes fell. "And the best way to right the wrong is to own up at once," said the little doctor. "I suppose she's taught you that, eh, Joel?" "Yes, sir," said Joel. "Well, when you've got such a mother as you have, Joel," continued Dr. Fisher, "you better treat her as well as you know how. So run along, and be quick with you." And Dr. Fisher gave him a resounding clap on the shoulder that sent Joel flying off like a shot from a gun, while the little doctor stole off the back way, and got into his gig, and drove off as fast as he could, and thus escaped being thanked. And the Badgertown folks got together and held a meeting in Mr. Atkinson's store that very evening, and said that it was a pity that Mrs. Pepper, who was struggling so to bring up all those 5 children, should have such a hard time. So each man put his hand in his pocket and fished out some money. And the carpenters came next day and mended up all the holes where the axe had cut through the roof, and the whole house was cleaned and dried where the water had run down, and then there was $1.45 left over, for people had been so very generous. "Just keep it, Mrs. Pepper," said the spokesman. "'Twill come in handy, most likely." And Mrs. Pepper couldn't speak, she was so taken aback. But they didn't seem to feel as if they hadn't been thanked enough, so they all went back again into the village. Ben had been working in a distant woodlot for Deacon Bludgett, and so hadn't heard a word of the fire until he got into the village on his way home. Then he said he wouldn't believe it, unless he should see for himself, so he ran every step of the way home, and rushed in all out of breath. "What happened?" he demanded of the first person he met. This happened to be Polly. "Oh, Ben!" she exclaimed, flinging her arms around him. And then followed all the story. And Ben continued to blink every now and then up at the ceiling, varied by hurrying out to gaze at the roof, when he would rub his eyes. "Dear me, Polly," he would exclaim, "it seems just like an awful dream." "I wish it was," sighed Polly, "and I guess Joel wishes so too." But the next day, when the Badgertown people came with their gift, then the 5 little Peppers changed about to the very happiest children in the world. And as soon as the visitors had gone, the whole bunch of Peppers just took hold of hands, and danced like wild little things around the table where the pile of silver quarters and 10-cent pieces lay. "Mamsie," said Polly, when at last they stopped to take breath, "did you ever know of such good people in the world as our Badgertown folks?" "I am sure I didn't," declared Mrs. Pepper, wiping her eyes. "May the Lord reward them, for I'm sure I can't." Polly suddenly left the ring of Peppers, and came close to her mother. "Perhaps you can sometime, Mamsie," she said soberly. "I hope so," replied Mother Pepper. Well, look forward to it, and take the chance if it ever comes, you may be sure, Polly." That night, when the little brown house was still as a mouse, Polly heard a loud scream come pealing down from the room in the loft. Mrs. Pepper, strange to say, didn't hear it at all. Poor woman, she was very tired with her work, from which she had been hurried so unceremoniously when the alarm of fire reached her, and she had lain awake all the first part of the night with a heart burdened with anxious care. "Joel's dreaming all about the fire, most likely," said Polly to herself. So she slipped on Mamsie's old wrapper, picking it up so that she would not trip and tumble on her nose as she sped softly over the stairs. "Joel, hush!" she said reprovingly. "You'll wake Mamsie and Phronsie. Ben, do make him keep still." "I can't," said Ben, only half awake. "Hush up there, Joe!" and he turned over a very sleepy face and tried to look at Polly. "'Tisn't me," said Joel in high dudgeon. "I ain't afraid, cat." And Polly stared to see David sitting on the edge of the bed he shared with Joel, and tucking up his feet well under him, while he shook with terror as he cried shrilly, "They're running all up my legs!" "Poor little thing!" exclaimed Polly, sitting down on the other edge of the bed, at the risk of getting on Joel's toes. "He's frightened," to the others. "I suppose you've been dreaming, Davy." "No, no!" cried Davy, huddling up worse than ever. "There goes one of 'em now!" he exclaimed suddenly, and pointed toward Polly. "He's just running under Mamsie's wrapper." Polly hopped off the bed in her liveliest fashion, while from under Mamsie's wrapper scuttered a black object over the bedquilt in the opposite direction. "What is it?" she cried, beginning to shake violently herself. "Oh, dear me! Are there any more of them?" "Yes," said Davy, "there are lots and lots, Polly. Oh, dear me!" He couldn't twist himself into a smaller knot than he was, so there he sat, as miserable as possible, with the tears rolling down his face. "Joel!" cried Polly, giving that individual a little poke in the back, as he appeared to be going off to sleep again. "You can tell about these black things. I must know. So what is it?" "Let me go to sleep," grunted Joel, twisting away from her fingers. "No," said Polly firmly, "I shan't, Joey Pepper. What are those black things that Davy— oh, dear me, there is another one!" And Polly hopped back upon the bed, for there was a second black creature steering straight for her in the dim light. Joel gave a long, restful sigh. "Do let me alone," he said crossly, but Polly leaned over and shook his shoulders smartly. "See here now," cried Ben, roused by all this. "You just sit up in bed, Mr. Joel, and tell Polly all you know about this business. Do you hear?" And suddenly over came Ben's pillow flying through the air, to tumble over Joel's chubby nose. "Nothin' to tell," declared Joel again, but he sat up in bed. "So you said before," said Polly, "but these black things got up here somehow, and you know all about it, I'm sure. So you've just got to tell all about it, Joel Pepper." "It's crickets," blurted Joel suddenly, "and Dave and me brought 'em to put in Ben's bed, and—" "Thank you," interrupted Ben, and "Oh, Davy," reprovingly said Polly. "I'm sorry," said little Davy, wriggling up his toes. "I didn't know they hopped so bad." "Oh, Polly, they're all running up my legs," he cried with another burst. "Never mind," said Polly, quite reassured. "They're nothing but dear, nice little crickets. I don't care now, but it's dreadful to see black things in the middle of the night when you don't know what they are." "I don't like 'em, Polly," wailed David. "I'd rather they be out of doors." "But you helped to bring 'em in," said Polly. "How could you, Davy?" she added reproachfully. "Dave didn't 'xactly help," said Joel uneasily. "I told him he'd got to go, Polly," he added honestly. "Oh, I see," said Polly. "Well, now, Davy, you're going downstairs to get into Mamsie's bed." "Oh, goody!" cried Davy, smiling through his tears, and stepping gingerly out of bed on the tips of his toes, lest he should meet a black cricket unawares, he skipped to the head of the stairs. "Shake your clothes," called Polly in a smothered voice, fearful lest Mamsie and Phronsie should wake up. Thereupon she began to shake the old wrapper violently. "We mustn't carry any of 'em downstairs," she said, while Joel set up a howl. "Oh, I don't want Dave to go downstairs and leave me," he whined. "Yes, you can stay up here with your crickets," said Polly coolly, having shaken off any possibility of one remaining on Mamsie's wrapper. And tomorrow morning you just step around lively and pick 'em all up and carry 'em outdoors," said Ben, before turning over for another nap. "Good night, Polly." "Good night, Ben," said Polly softly, going downstairs after Davy, who was pattering ahead. "And good night, Joey." "Good night," sniffled Joel. "Oh, dear me, I don't want Dave to go. Well, anyway, he ain't going away ever again, Polly Pepper, so there." The next morning, as soon as it was light enough to see them, Joel picked up all his crickets. It was no easy matter, for they made him an awful piece of work, hopping and jumping into all the corners, and, just as soon as his thumb and fingers were on them, away they were off again. But Ben had said everyone must go, so Joel kept at it until the perspiration just rolled from his tired, hot face. "I don't like 'em, Polly," he confided, when the last one was escorted out of doors, "and I ain't ever going to bring one in again." "I wouldn't, Joe," said Polly, "and it isn't nice to scare folks, I think." "I think so, too," said Phronsie, with a wise nod of her yellow head, as she sat on the floor, playing with David. "Think what, Phronsie?" cried Joel, suddenly. "What Polly said," replied Phronsie, patting Seraphina, who was being shown the pictures in a bit of old newspaper that David was pretending to read. "Ho, ho!" cried Joel, bursting into a laugh. "You don't know whatever you're talking about, Phron. Does she, Polly?" "Don't tease her," said Polly, but Phronsie didn't hear, being absorbed in correcting Seraphina, who had wobbled over on her back instead of sitting up elegantly to view the pictures. Joel ran down the next day to see Mrs. Beebe, Mother Pepper giving the long-desired permission. Davy had a little sore throat, and he much preferred to stay near Mamsie's chair. "Now, Joe, remember to be good," warned Mother Pepper, the last thing, when he had been washed and dressed and brushed and declared quite prepared. "I'm going to be always good," declared Joel. "I ain't ever going to be like Ab'm," he added in disgust. "Joel," reproved Mother Pepper sternly, "don't judge other folks. It's enough for you to do to look out for yourself." Joel hung his head abashed. "Well, good bye," said Mrs. Pepper, the stern lines on her face breaking into a smile. "Good bye, Mamsie." Joel flew back suddenly to throw his arms around her neck, then he rushed up to do the same thing to Polly, and then to Phronsie. "Don't kiss David," said his mother, "'cause you may take his throat." "Then I want to kiss him," cried Joel. "Mayn't I, Mommy?" he wheedled. "I don't want Dave to have it." "Oh, he'd have it just as much," said Mrs. Pepper, sewing away for dear life. "How could he?" cried Joel, in great astonishment, and standing quite still. "Say, Mammy, how could he, if I took it?" "You'd find if you took it there'd be quite enough sore throat for two," answered Mrs. Pepper. "Well, run along, Joe, you wouldn't understand, and 'tisn't necessary that you should, only you are to do as I say, that is all." So Joel ran off, waving a good-bye to David, and since he was not allowed to kiss him, he gave a rousing hooray, which delighted little Davy greatly, as he stood, his face pressed to the window, to see him go. Once within Mrs. Beebe's home, it was enchantment enough. It was a good afternoon for the shoe business, Mr. Beebe having 2 customers. One of them was a very fussy woman, who had a small boy in charge. Joel was in high glee at being called upon to help lift down ever so many boxes, until pretty near every shoe in stock was tried on. Mrs. Beebe kept coming out of the little parlor at the back of the shop and saying, "Ain't you through with Joel yet, Pa?" All of which made Joel feel very important indeed, and almost decided him to keep a shoe shop when he grew up, instead of being a stagecoach driver. "No," said Mr. Beebe shortly, "I ain't through with him, Ma. He's a master hand at getting them boxes down." "Hain't you got a pair a little mite broader across the toes?" said the woman. "Stand up and stamp in 'em, Johnny." So Johnny stood up and stamped in the new shoes. "Real hard," said his mother. So he stamped real hard. "I'd druther have another pair a mite broader," said the woman discontentedly. "I showed you some broader ones," said old Mr. Beebe. "Well, Joel, my boy, you'll have to climb up and hand down that box up in the corner. P'raps some of those will suit." So Joel, who wished he could be there every day in the year, and that the woman would all the time bring in boys who wanted different shoes from any that Mr. Beebe had, climbed up like a squirrel and brought the box to Mr. Beebe. "Now, marm," said the shoe store keeper, deftly whipping a good roomy pair, "I guess these are about what you want." Then he laughed cheerily. "No, they ain't either," said Johnny's mother, snappishly taking them and viewing them critically. "They're big as all outdoors, Mr. Beebe." "Well, he wants 'em to wear outdoors, don't he?" said Mr. Beebe, "so I guess they'll suit at last." "Well, they won't," said the woman, "and you needn't try 'em on, Johnny. They're a sight bigger than they orter be. I guess I can tell soon's I see a shoe." "Can't Joel come now, Pa?" asked old Mrs. Beebe, presenting her cap border in the doorway again. It was quite fine, with new pink ribbons which she had put on because she had company. "Yes, pretty soon, Ma," replied her husband, quite worn out. "Well, I'm sorry I can't suit you, Marm," turning to the woman, "but I honestly can't, for I've shown you every shoe in my shop. Here, Joel, we'll begin and pack 'em up again," he said, sorting the pairs out from the pile on the counter that ran across the side of the shop and slinging them by the string that tied them together over his arm. "I'll see that pair," said the woman, suddenly, touching one as it dangled over Mr. Beebe's arm. "All right, Marm," said Mr. Beebe, most obligingly. So he knelt down before Johnny again and pulled on the shoes, and Johnny's mother told the boy to stand up and stamp in 'em, all of which was performed, and old Mr. Beebe got up and pulled out his bandana and wiped his hot face. "Now that's something like," said the woman with a bob of her head, while her little eyes twinkled. "I guess I know the right shoe as well as the next one. Why didn't you show 'em to me before?" she snapped. "You've had them shoes on twice before," said Mr. Beebe, "or at least the boy has. First they were too broad, and then they were too narrer." "Well, I'll take 'em anyway now," said the woman, laying down the money. "And I guess I know as well as the next one whether my boy's tried on shoes or not." "Now, Joel," said old Mr. Beebe, when the little green door with its jangling bell had really closed on her and on Johnny, "as soon as we get these shoes back again in the boxes, you better run into the parlor, 'cause Ma'd been a-waitin' considerable." Joel, much divided in his mind whether he would rather stay in the shop altogether, with the delightful shoes, or go out and spend half of the time with Mrs. Beebe and the doughnuts and the pink and white sticks he felt almost sure were waiting for him, came to the conclusion that he really couldn't decide which was the more delightful, and then the shop door bell jangled again, and there was another customer. This time it was a little thin old man, and although he came from another town, he seemed to be a great friend of Mr. Beebe's, who now joyfully welcomed him. "Well, I declare if 'tain't Obadiah Andrews!" exclaimed the shoe shop keeper, radiantly, taking a good look at the newcomer. "I haven't seen you for a week of Sundays, Obadiah." "Nor I hain't seen you," declared the little man, just as well pleased, and sitting down gladly. "I'm most beat out a gettin' here, so I want some new shoes, Jotham, and I calc'late I'll get 'em about as nice as they make 'em here." "I calc'late so too, Obadiah," said old Mr. Beebe, rubbing his hands together in a pleased way. "Now, Joel, we'll get down all the shoes on this side," and he ambled across the shop, "and you can put up the boys' sizes afterwards if you want to." "Pa, ain't you most through with Joel? Oh, why, here's Mr. Andrews!" exclaimed Mrs. Beebe. Then she came into the little shop and sat down, while Mr. Beebe and Joel got out the shoes that were to be tried on. "It's so nice that I can pass the time of day with you meanwhilst," she observed. But it didn't take very long to satisfy old Mr. Andrews. As soon as the first shoe was pulled on he declared it was just right, although the shoe shop keeper offered to try on the others. "Perhaps these'll pinch when you get home," suggested Mr. Beebe anxiously, "or something else as bad will be the matter with 'em." But the little old man said, "No, do 'em up, Jotham." So the shoes were rolled in paper and tied with a red string, and then Mr. Obadiah Andrews said, "Now I'm a-goin' to set and visit, and pass the time of day with you, Jotham." "So do!" cried old Mr. Beebe delightedly, counting out the change. "Now, Joel, you can pile all them shoes back, and then finish the boy sizes if you want to, and after that, Ma, he can go into the parlor and be company to you." When Mrs. Beebe and Joel finally got into the parlor, leaving the two old friends talking busily, there only remained 10 minutes before it was time to go home. "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed old Mrs. Beebe, quite aghast, as she glanced at the clock. "Well, you must obey your ma, and the only thing I see out of it is, you must come again." So she stuffed into a paper bag all the pink and white sticks and doughnuts that were piled so nicely in a company fashion on a blue plate. "There," she said, smothering her disappointment as best she could. "Take these home with you, and tell your ma I expect you again some day. We can't help it, 'cause Pa's been so busy," as Joel ran off. "I've sold shoes all the afternoon," he screamed, rushing into the little brown house, and for a moment forgetting the paper bag and its precious contents. Then it came ever him in a burst. "Look at this!" swinging it over Polly's brown head. She bobbed it up suddenly. Look out!" screamed Joel, but too late. Polly's brown head bumped into the bag, and away it spun, and the doughnuts and the pink and white sticks went flying all over the kitchen floor. "Now that's too bad," cried Polly, jumping up to help pick them up. "Oh, Joel, what a perfectly splendid lot!" "Ain't it?" said Joel, his mouth watering, to begin on them. "Here's one more," spying a pink stick behind Mamsie's chair. "Here 'tis, I've got it," emerging in triumph and holding it fast. "Where's Phronsie and Dave?" "Over at Grandma's," said Polly. "Oh, dear," began Joel. Then he thought a minute. "I'm going to take Grandma a doughnut, Polly," he cried, dancing off, and swinging the bag into which he had crammed all the goodies. He heard Phronsie singing to Grandma, which she was very fond of doing, and perched up on the side of the bed, Grandma smiling away, as well pleased as though she heard every word. "Dave!" screamed Joel, bounding in and swinging the bag. "You don't know what I've got!" And he hopped up on the bed between Grandma and Phronsie. When Davy saw that, he got out of his chair and speedily hopped up onto the bed too. Grandma laughed till the tears rolled down her cheeks. "I guess you'll laugh more yet, Grandma," declared Joel, untwisting the top of his bag, and bringing a pair of bright black eyes very close to it to peer within. "It's perfectly splendid!" he cried, holding his hands so no one else could see. "Oh, Joey, do show us!" cried Phronsie, getting up to kneel on the patched bedquilt to look over his arm. "You may take one peek," decided Joel, suddenly, bringing his eyes away from the mouth of the bag to gaze at them. "Grandma must have the first one, then you must guess what it is." "I guess it's doughnuts," said little Davy, "'cause you've been to Mrs. Beebe's, and besides, I smell 'em." Grandma smiled all the time, just as happily as if she had heard everything that had been said. "There's something else," said Joel, emphatically, "but 'tisn't your guess. Now, Grandma," he held the bag close up to the old lady's cap border, "look." "My!" exclaimed the old lady. "What you got, Joel?" as he twitched away the bag. "Didn't you see?" cried Joel. "Well, you may have one more peek, 'cause you are Grandma," and he brought it up again before her eyes. "Doughnuts!" said Grandma. "My sakes, where'd you get 'em?" "You may have one," said Joel, peering into the depths of the bag to fish out a good-sized one, that was sugary all over, which he dropped in her hands. "Give me one," begged Phronsie, holding out both hands. "In a minute," said Joel. "Now, Grandma, what else is in here?" giving the bag a shake. "Hey?" asked Grandma. "Speak louder, Joel." "Oh, dear me, I can't speak so she'll hear," said Joel in despair to the others. So he shook the bag again, when the bottom of it came out, and away the doughnuts and pink and white sticks flew, and rolled all over the patched bed quilt. "There now," said Joel, in disgust, "there isn't any use in anybody's guessing anything. But we can eat 'em now," he added, brightening. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Adventures of Joel Pepper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stacey Chambers. The Adventures of Joel Pepper by Margaret SIDNEY. Chapter 26. Miss Parrott's Coach and the Coasting. It was snowing tiny flakes when Joel's eyes popped open, and the small feathery things whirled against the little paned window, as if they would very much like to come in. "Dave, Dave!" cried Joel, poking him. "Get up, it's snowing." David's eyes flew quite wide at that, and he sat up at once. "Oh, Joel!" he squealed, as he watched the flakes. "Ain't they pretty?" I guess so," said Joel, springing into his clothes. "They're nice for snowballs, and to slide on, anyway." David reached over for one blue woolen stocking on the floor by the side of the bed, and sat quite still with it in his hand, regarding the snowy whirl. "You ain't got dressed a bit," cried Joel, spinning around, "and I'm all ready." "So will I be all ready," cried little David, pulling on the stocking with all haste, and flying at the rest of his clothes with alacrity. "Wait, Joe, do," as Joe began to clatter downstairs. "Can't," said Joel, racing off. "I'm going to get the sled." "Wait," called Davy, half crying. But Joel was in the woodshed, hauling out the precious sled that Ben had made for the boys out of some boards and old sleigh runners that had been given him. He was dragging it out with a dreadful noise from the corner where it had stayed all summer, when Polly came running out. "I don't believe it's going to snow much," she said, squinting at the feathery specks. "You won't want your sled today, boys." "I'm going to have it ready," said Joel, with another pull. "Well, I'll help you," said Polly, taking hold of one end. "Dear me, I do think this is the most splendid sled in all the world," she exclaimed enthusiastically. "I don't see how Ben could make it so nice." "Ben can do anything," declared Joel, tugging away. "I know it," said Polly with pride. "Well, I wish he had time to go coasting all he wants to," she added sorrowfully. "Maybe he will have this winter," suggested Joel, who never could bear to see Polly sad. "Perhaps," said Polly, "but there's always wood to chop in the winter. Joe, here it comes!" as the big sled tumbled out with a rush to be dragged into the middle of the woodshed floor. David now came running downstairs, and Phronsie, hearing that the sled was to be drawn out, pattered into the woodshed too. "Oh, Polly!" she cried in rapture. "Now I'm going out to ride in it this very minute," and she danced round and round, clapping her hands in glee. "Oh, dear me!" cried Polly, pointing out at the little window. "See, Phronsie, there's only the least little bit of snow. Why, I do very believe it's going to stop." At this dreadful suggestion, every one of the little Peppers in the woodshed rushed to the window, and Joel flung wide the door, so that a cold blast carrying a feathery cloud of little flakes swept in. "Oh, Joel!" exclaimed Polly. "Shut the door, Phronsie'll catch cold." Joel was already out in the house place, dancing about, declaring it was going to be awful deep, and they could make a snowman soon, he guessed. So little Davy ran and pushed the door to, shutting off all chance of hearing the rest of what he was saying. He was gone some time, and the others ran into the kitchen, for Polly declared they would get no breakfast that day if she did not hurry up. And David and Phronsie thought it much nicer to watch the snowstorm from those windows than from the little tucked-up window in the woodshed. The consequence was that Joel ran in just as they had begun breakfast, in a fine glow, his cheeks very red, and his chubby nose as well. "Why didn't you come?" he demanded, with sparkling eyes. "Where?" cried Polly. "Oh, Joe, what have you been doing? Your face is red as fire." "And your nose is red, too," said David. "I don't care," said Joel, slipping into his seat. "Give me some mush, Polly, do," he begged hungrily, passing his bowl. "Oh, 'twas just prime, I tell you." "What?" asked Polly quickly. "You keep saying it's fine, and don't tell us what you've been doing. That isn't polite," she added, for Polly was quite particular as to her manners, and liked to be very genteel before the other children. "Oh, I've been riding in Miss Parrott's coach," said Joel, trying to appear as if this were an everyday occurrence, and eating on as if nothing had happened. Miss Parrott lived in an old ancestral house about 2 miles from Badgertown. She was very rich, but kept entirely to herself, and drove about in an ancient coach, the envy of all the villagers. "And I called you all to come, and you wouldn't." "Oh, Joel Pepper!" cried Polly, greatly shocked to think of the splendid chance they had all missed, and dropping the big spoon with which she was serving the mush. "You never called us one single bit." "No, you never did," added David solemnly, and looking at Polly with all his eyes. "Never did," echoed Phronsie, shaking her yellow head positively. "Polly, I want some more mush, I do." "Yes, I did too," spoke up Joel loudly. "Joel," reproved Mother Pepper. "Well, I did, Mamsie," repeated Joel in a very injured tone. "I called, just like this, 'Come quick and ride in Miss Parrott's coach.' So there." "Oh, dear me!" cried Polly passionately, sitting back in her chair. "I'd rather have gone in that coach than have done anything else. And now you've been, and we'll never get a chance again, never in all this world." "How did it happen, Joel?" asked Ben. "Do tell the whole story from the beginning." "Why, you see it was this way," Joel began. "Polly, give me some more mush, do," passing his bowl. "Oh, dear me, do tell first, Joe," cried Polly impatiently. "I don't know where the spoon is," for the big spoon had tumbled off to the floor, and she hadn't seen it go in the excitement. "Joel, get a clean one," said Miss Pepper. "Then pick up the other. It's likely fell down." So Joe hopped out of his chair and got a clean spoon for Polly, and then dived under the table and came back with the other spoon. "Now begin and tell us all about it," said his mother. "No, Polly, you mustn't help him the mush till he's told." So Joel, seeing he wasn't to get the mush until the whole story how he got his ride in the Parrott coach was related, began at once, and rattled it off as fast as he could. "The man that drives it stopped, and I was in the yard, and he said, 'Don't you want to all hands you children to drive? I've got to drive a piece down the road.' And I called and called you, and we went, and that's all. Now give me some mush." "If only we'd known," mourned Polly, clasping her hands. "Is it lined with green satin, Joel?" she asked suddenly. "I don't understand," said Mrs. Pepper in a puzzled way. "Where were you, Joel, when Miss Parrott's man asked you? And you didn't go bareheaded, and without your coat." "Out in the yard, Mamsie," answered Joel. "Polly, do give me some mush," for Polly was so absorbed waiting to hear if Miss Parrott's coach was really lined with green satin, that she had forgotten all about Joe and his breakfast. So now she hastily dipped out the mush into the bowl that was waiting for it. "Is it really lined with green satin, Joel?" she cried breathlessly. "I don't know," said Joel, all his attention upon his bowl of mush. "I most know it is," said Polly, leaning her elbows on the table and her head upon her hands. "To think how it would really seem to be riding in a coach lined with green satin. And now I shall never go," she ended. "Why didn't you come back for us?" asked David suddenly. He hadn't eaten anything since Joel had rushed in with the wonderful story, and between Polly's disappointment and his own was in a great state of distress. "Oh, I thought you were coming right off," said Joel, swallowing rapid mouthfuls. "And then, when I got into the coach, the man that drives Miss Parrott said he couldn't wait no longer." "Any longer, you mean," corrected Mrs. Pepper. "Yes'm," said Joel, "and then we drove off." "You see, we had shut the door to the woodshed," said Polly, "'cause Phronsie would catch cold if we didn't. And we didn't hear a single word when you called, Joel Pepper, not a single one." "Where'd you go?" asked David suddenly. "Oh, down to the center," said Joel, "to I guess 4 stores, and then he brought me home. That is, almost home. He dropped me at the corner." "O dear me!" exclaimed Polly. "Oh, jolly, look at the snow!" screamed Joel, flying out of his chair. And sure enough, while they had been so engrossed, there it had been coming down faster and faster, until it was a powdery veil almost too thick to see through. So somewhere in the middle of the morning, Joel and David started off with their sled, drawing on their mittens with the greatest satisfaction, and bobbing good-bye to the others watching them from the windows. All went well until Joe proposed that they should go to Simon's Hill, a long, steep thoroughfare some 2 miles distant, that swung at the bottom very abruptly into the turnpike, and trudging off there, they climbed it with dispatch and began to coast down. "Oh, whickets!" cried Joel, who was steering, little Davy hanging on behind, more than 3/4 afraid, though he wouldn't let Joel see it for all the world. "Gee-haw, gee-haw, wee dump, dump!" as they flew over the rises, bumping and twisting from side to side. "Oh, take care, Joe!" screamed David in terror. "We most went over," for one side of the road ran down abruptly into a thicket of evergreen and scrub oaks. "Ho, we're going straight," sang out Joel. "You're always such a fraidy cat, David Pepper." "I ain't a fraidy cat," protested Davy, "and I want to go home to mother." "Well, you're going down again, 11, no, I guess 60 times," declared Joel after this. "Gee whiz, bump, bump, bang!" This last was brought out of him by a sudden slewing to the side, where the slope ran off to the evergreen scrub oak thicket. But Joel missed the edge by about an inch, so he screamed with delight and whizzed safely down the rest of the hill. "I ain't going down ever again," said David. "Not once, Joel," as they flew along and the cold air swept his pale cheeks. Just then, along the turnpike, toward the abrupt turn of the hill road, was coming an ox pung, loaded with wood and driven by old Farmer Seeley, who was almost as blind as a bat and deaf as a post. "Hi!" screamed Joel, whizzing along. "See us come down?" But Farmer Seeley neither saw nor heard, and just then he concluded to steer his team up as near as possible to the hill road. Joel saw this and yelled, but he might as well scream to the hill. It was all done in a moment. Down flew the clumsy homemade sled that couldn't be turned in a second, Joel frantically steering to get past the big awkward team that was blocking up the way, David clinging to him in dumb helpless terror. Zzz, thud! And the first thing that old Farmer Seeley knew, 4 small arms and legs were waving frantically in the air, and thrown suddenly with a mixture of boards and runners against the ox team of wood, with an awful crash, and then all was still. "Land o' Goshen!" ejaculated Farmer Seeley at the crash. "What's that air? Oh, my gracious, Peters!" And he saw what it was as well as he was able, for his poor eyes, and getting off from the team, he went to the spot, shaking so in every limb that he could hardly walk. There was no sound beneath the upturned sled, where it lay just as it had been thrown against the wood pung, and for one dreadful moment Farmer Seeley thought the 2 boys, to whom the small legs and arm belonged, were dead, and he shook so his false teeth rattled in his head, and he sat right down in the snow. "I must dig 'em out," he said in a cold fright, "for they've druv their heads clean into the snow, and they may get suffocated, if they ain't already dead." So he did the best he could in that work, proceeding only a little way, when Joel bounced up suddenly, shook his black hair, and rubbed his eyes. "Oh, I remember," he said. "Now see here, you boys," screamed old Farmer Seeley angrily, "I'll have you took up, whoever you be, a running into my ox team, and a butting into my wood, I will." "Get Dave out!" cried Joel, who cared very little for whatever the old man might say, and pawing the snow wildly. "Help me get Dave out." "I can't help none," said the old man querulously. "I'm stiff in the joints, and besides, you've scared me to death a'most." "Oh, oh!" screamed Joel in a frightful panic. "Dave, get up, Dave!" But David lay like a little log of wood, as still as those on the old pung. End of chapter 26. Recording by Stacey Chambers. Chapter 26 of The Adventures of Joel Pepper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stacey Chambers. The Adventures of Joel Pepper by Margaret SIDNEY. Chapter 26. Princes and Princesses. "Polly," said Mrs. Pepper, "don't worry any more about the boys not coming home. Just keep the potatoes hot in the oven." For Polly had run to the window about a dozen times, wondering where they could be and why they didn't come back for dinner. "They are having a nice time somewhere, bless their hearts," said Mrs. Pepper with a smile. "I'm so glad the snow has come early, for they've been longing for it so much." She hadn't felt so happy and contented for a good while, for besides rejoicing in her boys' pleasure, Mr. Atkins had given her this very morning an order to knit as many mittens as she could, and she even caught herself humming a little tune. Polly heard her and ran over to her side. "Oh, Mamsie Pepper," she exclaimed, "do sing it," and she threw her arms around her neck. "I can't sing now," said Mother Pepper, a little flush coming on her cheek, "and besides, I don't need to with you, Polly," and she smiled fondly on her. "I'll stop, Mamsie, if you'll only sing to us more," cried Polly. "Then I should never sing, Polly," declared Mother Pepper with a little laugh. "I shouldn't know what to do, child, if I didn't hear you singing round." "Shouldn't you, Mammy?" asked Polly, much gratified, and curling down into a little ball at her mother's feet. "No, dear, I shouldn't." Mrs. Pepper stopped her work long enough to lay her hand caressingly on Polly's brown hair. "Why, it wouldn't seem like the little brown house at all, Polly, and I don't know what we should any of us do if you stopped it." "Then I'll sing always for you, Mamsie," said Polly. "I truly will." "So do, child. Well, I must hurry along, or I shan't get time to begin on those mittens. And just think, Polly, Mr. Atkins has promised to let me knit as many pairs as I can." "Mamsie," said Polly suddenly, and hopping to her feet, "won't you teach me to knit, and then I can help you?" "Yes," said Mrs. Pepper, "for it is good for you to know how. But I shan't be willing to have you help me any more than you do now. I wish you didn't have to work so hard, child." And an anxious cloud overspread the brightness on Mother Pepper's face. "Oh, I'm not going to work too hard," cried Polly, with happy throbs at her mother's words, and she dashed off to her interrupted work. And Mrs. Pepper smiled, as presently Polly began to sing so merrily that Phronsie set up a little song, till the old kitchen was the coziest place possible. At last, in a lull, Mother Pepper called, "Polly, what is this stopping at the gate? Tell him we don't want any," as she saw it was a load of wood. Polly ran to the door and was beginning to say, "We don't want any wood," when her face turned very white, and she ran over the snow on unsteady feet. "Oh, Joel, what is it?" throwing her arms around him. But before he could answer, there was Mrs. Pepper close behind her. They lifted Davy down from the pile of wood, where they had made him as comfortable as possible, Farmer Seeley and Joel. The old man tried to tell that "'Twarn't none of my fault, the boys ran into me," but Joel, for the first time in his life, was without words. "Mamsie, don't feel badly," said little Davy, putting his face up to be kissed, as her arms received him. Joel flew to Polly for comfort. "And Mr. Seeley's nice," said David, who had found out the old farmer's name on the long, slow homeward journey, and now seemed afraid he might be blamed, and not thanked enough. The old farmer, not hearing this, or indeed much of the talk, kept saying at intervals, "'Twarn't my fault, I ain't to blame," till Mrs. Pepper carried David into the little brown house, and the others following mournfully enough, the door was shut. David was laid up with a sprained ankle, that was all after the upset, but Joel found it dismal enough to play out in the snow alone, and he kept pretty close to the window so that he could look up and sing out once in a while to Dave, seated by it in Mamsie's big rocking chair. And pretty soon, one day, Ben brought Davy out, all bundled up, and set him carefully on the big sled. "There you are," cried Ben, depositing his burden, "as fine as can be." All the rest of the family flocking around to tuck David in tighter, and to pull his tippet closer, and to be sure that he had his mittens on. "Don't go very far, Joe," cautioned Mrs. Pepper. "I won't, Mamsie," said Joe, proudly enough marching off, while the big sled with Davy sitting upon it as happy as a king came sliding along behind. "Hooray!" cried a harsh voice, when they had proceeded in this way for a good distance down the road, David joyfully exclaiming every minute, "Oh, Joey, it's so good to get outdoors again." "Hooray!" screamed the voice again, and Joel, staring as hard as he could, saw two boys pop up from behind a stone wall, and come rushing down toward him, each with a large snowball in his hand. And the next thing the snowballs flew through the air, and one hit David in the neck and burst all over his tippet. Joel didn't care that the other one gave him a whack on the head. "You stop that!" commanded Joel, with a face as red as fire. "Don't you hit Dave again," and his black eyes flashed. "We're bigger'n you," sneered one boy, and he picked up some more snow and began to roll it into a hard ball. "No, you ain't either," contradicted Joel, who never would acknowledge any one to be bigger than himself. "And you let Dave alone, I say." "We're going to push him off the sled," said the other boy with a dreadful grin. At this Joel looked all around in despair for a moment, to see if anyone was coming who would help. "Davie's ankle, oh dear me," he thought, so he got between the sled and the biggest boy. "You let him alone," he cried sturdily, setting his teeth tight together. "Oh, 'fraid cat," laughed both boys, hopping about in glee and singing over and over, "'Fraid cat, 'fraid cat." Joel clenched his little brown hands together tightly. It was hard work not to fly at them and pummel away. But Davie's ankle, dear, dear, so he held his breath and kept still. Suddenly both boys made a rush at David, meaning to make him eat snow and have one ball thrust down his back at one and the same time. But Joel was too quick for them, and the first thing they knew, as David gave a scream at their approach, two hard little fists were pummeling them to right and left. "Stop it!" they cried, but Joel didn't know how to stop. He pounded away so much and so fast that they didn't exactly seem to know where he was going to strike next, that in a few minutes both boys were crying as hard as they could. "'Fraid cat," sang Joel, dancing around them and swinging his fist in the liveliest fashion. "Joel Pepper!" exclaimed a voice suddenly that made all the boys skip, while little Davie shook in much worse apprehension than he did before. "Fighting in the public road! Well, I never heard anything so dreadful." Joel whirled around, his fist still ready. "I ain't fighting," he denied stoutly. It was Miss Jerusha, Parson Henderson's sister. "And it's bad enough to fight without telling a lie about it," said Miss Jerusha, holding up her black gloves in horror. "I ain't fightin', and I didn't tell a lie," declared Joel. "And you mustn't say so," he added, advancing on her with blazing eyes. Miss Jerusha retreated. "You're a very bad boy," she said tartly, "and I shall have no more to say to you." "You must say I don't tell a lie," insisted Joel with unpleasant firmness, and throwing his head back. "What are you doing if you're not fighting?" began Miss Jerusha, loudly. "Pray tell." Joel was just going to say they were going to hurt Davie when, before he could get the words out, Polly was seen running down the road toward them all, her hood flying back on her shoulders. "Oh, Joel, what do you think?" she began, when she saw the two boys, and worst of all, Miss Jerusha. Then she came to a dead stop. "Where are your manners?" snapped that lady, wanting to scold someone. "I'm sure when I was a girl I was pretty spoken when I met people." "How do you do, Miss Jerusha?" asked Polly. Then she couldn't help regarding the two boys with wide-eyed astonishment. They dug the toes of their shoes in the snow and wouldn't look at her. "She says I told her a lie," blurted Joel, not taking his blazing eyes from Miss Jerusha's face. "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Polly, in the greatest distress. "Joel couldn't tell a lie, marm. He never did." Joel flung his black head higher, but he didn't take his eyes from Miss Jerusha's face. "I'm sure I don't know nor care whether he did or not," retorted Miss Jerusha shrilly. "And you're very pert, Polly Pepper, to set yourself up against your elders. When I was a girl, I never contradicted folks, never in all the world. What is your mother thinking of, to bring you up in this way?" And she held up her black gloves again. "Polly," called little Davie, where he had been crouching timidly in the middle of the big sled, "can't we go home?" "Yes," said Polly hoarsely. "Joel, come home with me this minute. Don't say another word. Mamsie wouldn't like it," she commanded. She seized the rope, and Joel, removing his eyes with the greatest difficulty from Miss Jerusha's face, grasped it too. And the little Peppers went as swiftly as they could go, back home to Mamsie, leaving the other three in the middle of the road. "Oh, dear," gasped Polly as they ran on. "Then, Joel, if we can only get to Mamsie," while on the back of the sled Davie trembled with delight at the very thought. In front of the little brown house stood a big comfortable sleigh of the old-fashioned pattern. Although it had once been very handsome, it was now faded and ancient. A man who almost looked as if he had gone into service along with the sleigh and the other belongings of his mistress, sat primly upon the front seat. He expressed as much pleasure at seeing the little Peppers coming as his stoical countenance would allow, but he didn't move a muscle of face or figure. At any other time Joel would have howled with delight at seeing Miss Parrott's man sitting there before the house, and in a sleigh. And it wouldn't have been a minute before he would have been in that sleigh, and on that front seat, besieging that stiff figure to let him drive. But now Joel flew by, dropping the rope, and rushed into the house. And Polly was left to drag David to the door, and call Mamsie to help lift him off. But she stopped to say to Miss Parrott's man, "I must stop to speak to Mamsie first, if you please." Miss Parrott's man so far forgot the ancient usage of his years that he rubbed his eyes as Polly turned away, and then he turned and continued to gaze at her as long as she was to be seen, for he really could not believe that it was the same little girl who had danced down the road, with sparkling eyes and rosy cheeks, and he even glanced nervously around the more he thought about it. "Mamsie!" cried Joel, hoarsely, flinging himself into Mother Pepper's arms, as she came to the door to meet him, her face beaming with happiness at the realization that Miss Parrott's sleigh was actually waiting at the door to take her little ones for a sleigh ride. "Mamsie, Miss Jerusha says I told a lie. Did I, Mammy?" And Joel clutched her and broke into a torrent of tears. And then Polly got there, and Davy was lifted off the sled and carried into the house, and among all three of them the story was out. And there was Miss Parrott's man sitting stiffly on the front seat of the sleigh, only his head was turned, and his eyes were staring like all possessed at the little brown house. "Now, Polly," said Mrs. Pepper, when there was no more to tell, and the children gazed at her in amazement to see her so cheerful, "you just get yourself ready as soon as ever you can. Wash your face good, and your eyes, and I'll spring too, and help Joey and Davy. Phronsie's all ready." Indeed she was, and sitting patiently on her little cricket all this time, her small mittened hands folded in her lap. To Phronsie every bit of the fuss of getting ready for a trip was always as much of a delight as the expedition itself, and was enjoyed with grave pleasure. "And dear me," continued Mother Pepper in her briskest fashion, all the while she was washing and patting and pulling the two boys into just the right condition for such a grand occasion as this, "there's Miss Parrott's man waiting out there all this time. Now see how good you can stand still, Joey, and then we'll be as quick as we can be." And pretty soon they were all ready, and Joel's swollen nose and red eyes didn't look so very much as if he had been crying, and Polly's face showed very little trace, after all, that she had been crying too. So they all went down to the gate, Mother Pepper and Polly and Joel carrying David, and Phronsie walking gravely behind. "I'm very sorry," said Mother Pepper to Miss Parrott's man, still immovably staring at them, "to keep you waiting. It is not my children's fault, I should say that." Then she helped them in, and tucked the big fur robes all nicely around the three in the back seat. Joel, of course, was by this time snugly settled on the front seat. "Now, children," said Mrs. Pepper, regarding them for a moment, and standing quite still by the roadside, "you are to have the very nicest time you ever had in all your lives. Remember," and she smiled at them, and all the sunbeams that ever shone seemed to hop right down into their hearts. Miss Parrott's man solemnly gathered up the reins tighter in his hands, and touched the horses with the whip with the same dignity, and off they went. Mrs. Pepper watched the big sleigh till she couldn't see a speck of it. Then she turned and went into the house, took down her Sunday bonnet and shawl, for this was to be a call of importance, and soon she had left the little brown house, and was walking rapidly over the snowy road to the minister's house. "I must get it over with as soon as I can, and be home before they get back," she said to herself, going swiftly on. It wasn't 2 minutes before Joel was laughing gaily, and bobbing around with an important air on that front seat to the others on the back seat, and Polly found herself tossing scraps of nonsense back at him and the two others, and little Davy smiled happily. As for Phronsie, she sat wedged in between the other two, her little mittens folded in her lap in grave satisfaction. Miss Parrott's man drew a long breath when all this was accomplished, and the only word he said for the first 2 miles was, "I guess you're all right now." Where they went, no one of the 4 little Peppers could have told. It all seemed like a fairyland, a great enchanted space of winding snowy roads, dazzling in the morning sunlight of a perfect winter day. Every little crystal sparkling away on a pine tree, where it had to melt away, seemed to come out and wink at them as the stately horses bore them along. All the fields, sleeping under their soft white blankets, were new to the Peppers gliding by. That surely was not Deacon Brown's field, where they used to race across lots on a summer day. As for that being Mr. Blodgett's meadow, why, no one need ever tell them so. It was enchanted ground, and they were princes and princesses whirling by in their chariots. "Let's play so," cried Polly, suddenly, and leaning back against the padded cushion, feeling very glad indeed. "What, Polly?" cried Joel, wheeling around at the imminent danger of tumbling out backwards, and astonished that Polly would want to play anything when they were enveloped with such richness of enjoyment. "Oh, that we're princesses and princes," answered Polly with a grand air, "and we were riding through our kingdom in a big chariot." "Oh, yes, let's," screamed Joel, "and I'm the biggest prince," he announced with another shout. "I wished I had a feather in my cap," he added ruefully, remembering the splendid one that Grandma Bascom's rooster had furnished for a former occasion, when Polly decked him out a prince, and that was tucked away in his box of treasures in the woodshed. "Oh, dear, if only I'd brought it." "But we haven't got our things," said Polly quickly, "so you must just play it, Joel. That's as good as having the feather." "I think it's heaven," said little Davy, with a long breath hanging out as far as he could over his side of the back seat. "Polly, isn't it?" "Yes, dear," said Polly, leaning past Phronsie to drop him a kiss, which by reason of the big sleigh going just then over a hump of frozen snow fell on the tip of his nose. This made him laugh, and then Polly laughed, and Phronsie came out of her grave delight to gurgle her amusement. And Joel, hearing them all have such a funny time back there, bobbed around again, and he laughed, though he never found out what it was all about. And Miss Parrott's man learned more about princesses and princes and golden chariots and fairylands and enchanted things and places in general than he had ever heard in his life before. And when they at last glided into Badgertown Center, it really seemed as if the cup of happiness would overflow. "Polly!" cried little David, his cheeks aflame under his woolen cap that was drawn closely around his ears, and sitting quite erect as a prince should. "The people are all coming out to meet us. The Queen and King have sent us to do errands, haven't they, Polly?" "Yes," cried Polly, delighted at the idea. "Oh, let's play that." So the four little Peppers drove down Badgertown Main Street, where all the shops were, and old Mr. Beebe happened to be standing by his little window watching for customers. "Ma, Ma!" he screamed. "Here's the Pepperses going by in a sleigh. It's Miss Parrottses, I do declare." And Mrs. Beebe, stopping to put on her best cap with the pink ribbons before she ran out from the little parlor of the back of the shop, of course didn't get there till long after the triumphal procession was over. And of all the people who stared and rejoiced in their happiness, for there wasn't one who saw them who didn't feel glad down to the tips of the fingers and toes that the Peppers were going a-pleasuring, no one of them all suspected that it was a chariot load of princes and princesses gliding by. At last it was all over, and the golden chariot paused before the little brown house. Polly and Joel carried David over the snowy path, while Phronsie ran ahead like a mad little thing. And so they all rushed in, royalty dropping off at the old flat doorstone. "We've been princes!" cried Joel, as Polly set Davy down, and stamping the snow gathered on the royal rush over the yard from his feet. "And I was the biggest prince." "I was the best," declared David, twitching off his cap that had gotten knocked over his eyes in the scramble to carry him in. "Mamsie, I truly was." "Oh, Mamsie!" cried Polly, dancing around the kitchen on happy feet, her eyes glowing like stars. "It was perfectly gorgeous," for Polly dearly loved fine words, and she thought nothing could be too grand for this occasion. "And I was a princess," piped Phronsie, crowding up to hold fast to her mother's gown. "I truly was, Mamsie. Polly said so." "So you were," declared Mamsie, smiling happily on her whole brood. "But then you mustn't ever forget, children, that it's well enough to be princes and princesses once in a while, but you're my little brown house people every day." End of chapter 26. Recording by Stacey Chambers. End of The Adventures of Joel Pepper by Margaret Sidney.